The price was $15. That was what Petra Dunmore was worth, according to the man who'd raised her. $15 and a handshake, settled in the back room of a trading post, while she waited outside in the February cold, not yet knowing that the life she'd had, however small, however hard, was already gone. She found out the way most women found out things in those days, not by being told, by watching the expression on her father's face when he came back through the door. That particular mix of relief and shame that men wear when they've done something they can't undo and don't intend to apologize for. "You're going with Reuben Holt," he said. She didn't ask why. She already knew why. The harvest had failed 2 seasons running, and her father owed money to men who didn't wait. Reuben Holt was not a cruel man in the obvious way. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike her. He simply made it clear, in the wagon ride north, that she was to cook and clean and keep the house, and that the $15 her father had accepted would be worked off over time, at a rate he'd decided on, which meant she would be working it off for the rest of her life if he chose to calculate it that way, which he did. She spent 2 years in his house on the edge of the Gallatin Valley, 2 years of early mornings and late nights, and never quite enough to eat. 2 years of watching the mountains to the northwest and thinking that if she could just get there, if she could just get deep enough into that country, no one would come looking. The night she left, there was no moon. She took a wool blanket, a tin cup, and a horn-handled knife that had belonged to Holt's first wife. She left everything else. She walked north until the trading post was behind her, and then she kept walking, because stopping felt like dying, and she wasn't ready to die. By the 3rd day, she wasn't sure anymore. The snow had come in overnight, not a dusting, but a real Montana storm, the kind that comes sideways and turns the world white and featureless in under an hour. She had made it further into the foothills than she'd expected, following the tree line, keeping the wind at her back, but now she couldn't tell north from east. And the blanket was soaked through, and her feet had stopped hurting, which she understood was not a good sign. She sat down against a lodgepole pine because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She didn't close her eyes. She'd heard enough to know that closing your eyes was how it ended. It was the horse she heard first. Not hooves, the creak of a saddle, the huff of breath in cold air. Then a shadow through the trees, and the shadow was enormous, and for one blurred moment she thought it might be a bear. It wasn't a bear. The man who pulled his horse up 10 feet from where she sat was somewhere past 40, with a dark beard, gone grey at the jaw, and a buffalo coat that looked like it had been through worse winters than this one. He looked at her, the way a person looks at something they're trying to decide whether to believe. She looked back at him and said nothing, because she had nothing left. He got down from the horse without speaking. He pulled a second blanket from behind his saddle, dry, heavy, smelling of wood smoke, and held it out, not toward her exactly, just out, in the space between them, so she could take it or not. She took it. His name was Callum. She learned that later. In the moment, he just said, "Can you ride?" And when she nodded, not entirely honestly, he helped her up onto the horse and led them north through the trees. She thought about the knife in her coat pocket the whole way. She didn't use it. His cabin sat in a fold of the mountain that the wind seemed to forget about. It was small and low, built from timber he'd clearly cut himself, with a stone chimney and a porch that leaned slightly east, as if it had spent too many years listening to the valley below. There was a lean-to for the horse, and a woodpile stacked taller than she was, and a cellar she didn't know about, yet dug into the hillside behind the cabin, full of things he'd put up for a long winter alone. He'd been planning on being alone. He made that clear without saying it. He gave her the bunk near the stove. He took the floor on the other side of the room, rolled in canvas like a man who'd slept outdoors. So often he'd forgotten there was another way. He didn't ask her where she'd come from or what she was running from. He didn't ask her anything that first night. She lay awake for a long time listening to the fire and the wind outside, and trying to figure out what kind of man didn't ask questions. She decided he was either very wise or very dangerous, and she fell asleep before she could determine which. His name was Callum Stroud, and he'd been in these mountains for 11 years. She learned this not from him, but from the small evidence of the cabin. The notches in the doorframe, where he'd marked years, the worn path between the door and the woodpile, the way he moved through the space like a man who had arranged it precisely to his own needs and not altered it since. 11 notches, 11 winters. He'd had a wife once. She found this out from a woman's comb on the windowsill, bone-handled, a few long dark hairs still caught in the teeth. Callum never mentioned her. Petra never asked. The first week was silence, mostly. He went out in the mornings to check his trap lines and came back in the afternoons with whatever the land offered. Snowshoe hare, sometimes a grouse, once a beaver whose pelt he stretched, and hung without comment. She cooked what he brought. She kept the fire. She stayed out of his way, and he stayed out of hers. And it was an arrangement that worked, because neither of them required anything more. At the end of the first week, she asked if she could help with the traps. He looked at her for a moment in that way he had, not unfriendly, exactly, just measuring, and then he said, "Can you walk in snowshoes?" "No, I'll show you." He did. He was a patient teacher, in the way that people are patient, when they've never had to explain something before, and have thought about it carefully before speaking. He showed her twice. He didn't repeat himself a third time. He seemed to assume she was competent until she proved otherwise, and she found she didn't want to prove otherwise. By the second week, she was setting the near traps herself. She'd been cold for so long that she'd started to forget what warm felt like, except in abstract. The cabin was warm. The stove was warm. When Callum came in from outside and stood near the fire, there was warmth that came off him, like something radiating from stone that's been in the sun, stored up, slow to release. She noticed these things the way you notice things when you're trying not to notice them. She also noticed that he never stood closer than necessary, never touched her, except once, by accident, when they reached for the same thing in the dark, and his hand closed briefly over hers before he pulled back. He apologized. Just one word. "Sorry." And then he moved away. She thought about that for 3 days. She thought about a lot of things she didn't have words for yet. It happened in the 5th week. Callum had gone further than usual to check a set of traps he'd laid down in the creek valley, and she was alone in the cabin, mending a tear in the canvas of his pack, when she heard the horse come back wrong, too fast, stumbling. She was outside before she'd made the decision to be outside. Callum was slumped in the saddle, with one hand gripping the horn, and his left leg at an angle that made her stomach turn. He'd broken through ice on the creek crossing, gone down hard on a submerged rock. The leg was broken below the knee. She could tell from the way it moved when she helped him down. He didn't make a sound the whole way inside. She got him onto the bunk. She got his wet clothes off, and packed him in every blanket she could find. She set water to boil, and found the whiskey he kept on the high shelf, and the strip of worn leather he used for her, to figure out what she thought he used it for. And then she splinted the leg herself with 2 pieces of kindling and strips cut from her second skirt, the one she'd been saving for no reason she could name. He passed out halfway through. She was grateful for that. When he came back to himself, an hour later, the fire was high and the water was hot, and she was sitting on the floor beside the bunk, with her arms around her knees, watching him the way she'd watched the mountains on all those evenings in Holt's house, like something she needed to survive. "The traps," he said. "I'll get them. You don't know where the far ones. You'll draw me a map." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Then he said, "There's paper in the box under the bunk," and that was that. She ran his trap lines for 6 weeks. The first time she got lost, she was gone 4 hours longer than she should have been, and when she came back through the door, he was sitting up in the bunk, which she'd told him not to do, with an expression that was not quite worry, but was adjacent to it. She dropped the pack on the table and said, "Creek flooded the east trail. I went the long way," and he lay back down without a word. But she'd seen his face before he got it arranged again. She thought about that too. The days had a shape to them now. She learned which traps produced, and which ones. Callum kept out of habit, more than hope. She learned that the horse, whose name was something in the Crow language she couldn't pronounce, would follow her without being led if she talked to her. She learned that Callum slept light, and that when the wind changed direction at night, he woke up, just for a moment, and listened, and then went back to sleep. She learned that she could move through the world here without being afraid of it. That was the thing she hadn't expected. The mountain was hard. Everything about it was hard, but the hardness was honest. It didn't pretend to be something else. It didn't make promises it had no intention of keeping. She'd been living with men who made promises for long enough. The mountain's honesty felt like something she hadn't known she was starving for. Callum's leg healed crooked. She knew it before he knew it, because she could see the way it lay when he slept, and the way he tried to hide the pain when he started walking on it again in the 7th week. He didn't complain. She hadn't expected him to. She did the heavy work for longer than either of them discussed, and he let her, and she understood that this was its own kind of trust. Spring came late to that fold of the mountain, but it came. The snow pulled back from the south slopes first, then from the meadow below the cabin. And one morning, Petra woke to the sound of water running where water hadn't run for months. She lay still and listened to it for a long time before she got up. Callum was on the porch when she came out, standing at the rail with his weight, slightly favoring the right leg, looking down the valley. The light was different in spring, thinner, cleaner, like something newly washed. It made everything look like it was seeing itself for the first time. She stood beside him, and they looked at the same valley and didn't speak. After a while, Callum said, "The pass will be open in another 3 weeks." She understood what he wasn't saying. The pass would be open. She could go. That was the fact of it, laid out plain, the way he laid out everything, without comment, without pressure, without asking her what she intended to do. She went inside and she thought about it for 2 days. She thought about Holt's house, which was not a home. She thought about her father, who had made his calculation and was not going to unmake it. She thought about the women in town, who had looked at her sometimes with a kind of sorry recognition, and the women who hadn't looked at her at all, because looking felt too much like admitting something. And she thought about the trap lines in snow up to her knees, and the way Callum's horse had started choosing to stand near her when there was no particular reason to, and the bone-handled comb on the windowsill, and the notches in the door frame that meant 11 years of a man deciding every single day to stay. On the 3rd day, she went to the place under her mattress where she'd kept the thing she hadn't told him about. She'd had it since she left Holt's house, a folded paper, creased and soft from handling, that Reuben Holt had drawn up himself in the back room of a trading post, a document that said, in his careful hand, that Petra had been received in exchange for the settlement of a debt, signed by her father, countersigned by Holt, witnessed by a man whose name she didn't know. She'd taken it the morning she left. She'd thought, when she took it, that she might need it, as proof of something, though she hadn't known what. She carried it outside. Callum was splitting wood at the block, the way he did every morning, slow and methodical on the healing leg. He heard the door and looked up, but she was already moving, and she didn't stop at the porch. She walked to the fire pit, where they burned trash and waste from butchering, and she held the paper over the ashes, and she lit a match from the tin she kept in her coat pocket. The paper caught at the corner and burned fast, the way old paper does, and she held it until the last possible moment and then let it fall and watched it become nothing. When she turned around, Callum was watching her, leaning on the axe, not asking. She walked back toward the porch. When she got close enough, she stopped. "I want to stay," she said, "if you'll have me, not because I have nowhere else to go." She looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to look at things up here, straight on, without flinching. "Because this is where I want to be." Callum set the axe down against the block. He was quiet for long enough that she heard a meadowlark somewhere below, on the thawing slope, the first bird in months. Then he said, "I was hoping you'd say that." That was all, but the way he said it, the weight of it, the steadiness, the plain and unornamented truth of it, told her everything about what it had cost him to wait and not ask, for all those weeks, for all those months of her making her own way toward her own answer. She nodded once. He picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, and she went inside to start the morning fire. And the meadowlark sang on, in the valley below. That was the spring that Callum Stroud stopped making one notch in the door frame at the end of each year. The following winter, he made two.